Good evening, Gwina Usually, fellow gaffers. Christmas Eve last was the 125th anniversary of a terrible tragedy that took place in Dublin Bay in 1895. Now, when a ship called the Palme got blown into the south side of the bay in a terrible storm, and a terrible tragedy unfolded. Now, it wasn't the crew of the Palme that were lost. It was all 19 people aboard were subsequently saved. But by a terrible twist of fate, all 15 of the Dunleary, then Kingstown, lifeboat crew were lost when they went out to try and effect a rescue. Now, I first put this talk together in 1995. I'm sure Stephen Wynne will remember that because he was there. And I've given it several times since, but I think it's very, very appropriate that we remember these brave men. And I was delighted to be asked by the All Gaffers Association to give the talk. I think it's very appropriate that we remember the lifeboat and remember lifeboat men everywhere in the present day and age when they go out to try and save us in our hour of need. So all of our talks, as Johnny said, are in aid of the lifeboat. So I'm hoping that everybody that's watching tonight will make a contribution to that, to the fund. So I'm going to begin by telling you about something about the ship that was involved, the Palme. It may have been pronounced Palme, but people in Dublin have called it the Palme since the event in 1895. So we'll continue to call it the Palme. I'll just show you, there's one image of the ship, a painting by this man here, the most famous ship portraitist from Liverpool, William Howard York. And it's a lovely painting by him for the captain of the ship, Captain Virren. And it presently hangs in the Alan Shiffords Museum, which is the museum in Mariham in the Åland Islands, where the ship hailed from. Now, it was originally an American downeaster, that they call it. It was built in the great tradition of the American clipper ships, except that it belongs to the era that followed that immediately. And it was built in the very same way, in the same yards as the clippers, except that it had a larger cargo carrying capacity. But they were massively built, these ships. It was owned at the time of the tragedy in a place called Mariham in the Åland Islands, which is a group of islands in between Sweden and Finland. It's actually part of Finland. Swedish is the language there, but it's actually part of Finland. Now you can see from this painting that the ship is flying the old Imperial Russian flag, which has come back into prominence in recent times. At the time of the tragedy, the Palme, or rather Finland, was part of the Tsarist Empire. Now, it was originally called the Frederick Tudor, the ship. And I'll tell you a little bit about Frederick Tudor because it's a very interesting story. I could give you a lecture on Frederick Tudor alone. He was known as the Ice King of America, and he died in the same year that the ship was built, 1866. And he had devised the method of transporting ice by ship from Boston in Massachusetts, where the ship was built and where he came from, to all parts of the globe. He made these artificial ponds and harvested the ice from them, and he sent it to places as far afield as Australia and India, and he became a multi-millionaire from that. So the chances are that the people who bought the ship may have chartered ships to the Tudor Ice Company and named the ship after him. So I just wanted to tell you that these ships were extremely heavily built, well built from natural forests, massive amounts of timber available. This will just give you an idea of the sort of scantlings of timber that went into a vessel like the Palme. These are huge keelsons. And I think it was that fact that contributed to the crew being saved, that the ship didn't break up when it took the ground in Dublin Bay. Now, the ship was sold in 1890, I think, to a firm called Bischoff's in Vegasack near Bremen. And in 1893, it was bought by Axel Ericsson, who came from the Åland Islands. You can see there the little red dot, that's where the Åland Islands are, up in the mouth of the Gulf of Bothnia, between Finland and Sweden. Mariham was the home of the last great big fleet of commercial sailing ships that ever sailed the oceans of the world. that kept going in profit, carrying cargoes right up into the 20th century, I think till the 1940s, that were owned by this man here, Gustav Ericsson, who was a nephew of the man who owned the Palme, Axel Ericsson, although they spelt their names differently. They were uncle and nephew. Now, in October 1895, the Palme had a refit in Mariehamn and loaded a cargo of timber to sail down to Liverpool. They discharged the cargo of timber. It took some time to do that in Liverpool, and they went over to Birkenhead to await orders to get an outgoing cargo. Now, no outgoing cargo was forthcoming, so they had to wait for a while, and they got orders then to proceed to Mobile in Alabama to pick up a cargo of pitch pine, and they had to go there in ballast. Excuse me. Now, at this stage, I'm just going to tell you a bit about the weather in the last month of 1895. It was one of the worst months on record since records began for weather. The month began with southwesterly gales, and they gradually backed around until in the Christmas week, in the last week of December, it was blowing a full gale from just a little bit south of east, about east by south. And it was out into this sort of weather that the Palme proceeded. They got towed out down the Mersey by a tug on the 18th of December. And they got towed down almost as far as Holyhead, and the tug was let go, and they proceeded down the Irish Sea. Now they only got as far as the Tusker Rock. It took them nearly a week to get down as far as the Tusker Rock. And when they got that far, they literally couldn't proceed any further. The weather was so bad, and the gales were increasing all the time. So they decided to turn and go back up the Irish Sea, possibly with the intention of going north about. But when they got as far as the Rock of Billite in the early hours of Christmas Eve, the captain decided that they simply couldn't go any further, that a lot of the sails had been blown out and were hanging in flitters from the yards. The crew were exhausted, having been up and down the masts, changing sail and bending on new sails and so forth. So they decided to run for Dublin port to get shelter and to get the ship back in order again. So they managed to get the ship about, and they headed for the mouth of Dublin port. Now, the weather closed in very badly. The visibility got very bad. There was rain squalls and hail squalls, and they couldn't see the entrance to Dublin port. So they sailed over. They could just about make out Dunleary Harbour, or Kingstown as it was then. And at about 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve morning, they let go both anchors just at the mouth of the harbour of what's now Dunleary, near the West Pier. Now, they made signals then requesting a tug. Now, straight away, word got around Dunleary very quickly that there was a ship anchored out off the mouth of the harbour in this howling gale. It was reckoned to be about force 10. I'll just tell you, if you read the newspapers of the day, the damage that was done by this gale was incredible. There was a man drowned in a flash flood not far from where I'm sitting at the moment, just down the street from here. And there was chimneys blown down. There was flying slates. People were injured by flying slates. And there was about 10 shipwrecks around the Irish coast, particularly on the east coast. So a lot of people had gone down the end of the West Pier, and there are a lot of accounts extant of what happened next. Almost straight away, the anchors began to drag, and the ship began to drift up into the upper reaches of the bay. She ultimately went to ground where that black X is there. The word reached the harbour master, who was also the launching authority for the lifeboat. He was secretary of the lifeboat back then, Captain the Honourable Francis G. Crofton. That's him there on the left as a young naval officer in command of a ship. And this picture of him on the right was taken roughly around the time that the tragedy occurred. So the first thing he did was he got a picture of his steam launch. He got into a steam launch and he went down Dunleary Harbour to a tug that was anchored in the harbour. It was a fairly small tug, and he went aboard the tug and he asked the captain, would he go out and try and tow the vessel in, throw the Palme into the harbour. The captain of the tug took a look out at the weather and said that he wasn't going to risk his ship or the lives of his crew. So Captain Crofton came back to the lifeboat house then, and he telephoned to the Clyde Shipping Company. Now, the Clyde Shipping Company kept a fleet of tugs in most of the ports all around Britain and Ireland for the purpose of towing ships in and out of port. And there were 2 tugs in Dublin at the time at Customs House Quay, the Flying Sprite here in the foreground and the Flying Swallow. That's the Flying Sprite. They were paddle tugs. And he telephoned to them and asked them would they send the tugs out to try and tow the Palme in. So they always kept steam up on the tugs, ready to go at a moment's notice. So they headed off down the Liffey, and when they got as far as the Poolbeg lighthouse, in between the lighthouses, they had to turn back. The tugs nearly overturned, and this one actually took a sea down the funnel, which practically nearly dampened the fires altogether. So they had to. And later in the day, this tug tried to tow the Poolbeg lifeboat out into the bay, but again, they had to turn back. So they telephoned Captain Crofton to say that they weren't able to get out. So at that stage, Captain Crofton decided to send out the lifeboats. Now, he made signals requesting the men to come. The maroon rockets were fired. And this is where the lifeboat was kept. There were 2 lifeboats in Dunleary at the time. One of them was kept in the old lifeboat house here. And the other one was kept afloat near where the present day lifeboat would be kept at anchor. Now, in all, 24 volunteers arrived, and the Captain Crofton decided to send out the 2 lifeboats. So I'll just give you an idea. The first people to arrive were the coxswain. There was a permanent coxswain, a man on the left, Alexander Williams, and his father, Henry, who was the driver. He used to drive the Harbour Master steam launch. And Henry was an ex-coxswain. He had served as coxswain of the Dunleary lifeboat for 40 years. And he was the recipient of the RNLI Silver Medal. But in all, as I said, 24 volunteers arrived. So they started getting one of the boats ready, the larger of the 2 boats, the Civil Service number 7. Now, I'll just give you an idea. That's one of the lifeboats there in the old lifeboat house, and it was kept on a sliding trolley. The 2 lifeboats that were there were the Hannah Picard, which is the smaller of the 2 lifeboats that was kept in the lifeboat house. Now, this is not it. It looked exactly like this, though, except that it had 2 lug sails. This one has a triangular sail on the mizzen. But they were powered by oars and sail, both of the boats. Now, the other boat looked exactly like this. It was called the Civil Service number 7, and this boat here was the one that replaced it, called the Dunleary. It was built to exactly the same plans, the same lines, by a famous Dublin firm of boat builders called Holways. This is her on our sea trials. Apparently she sailed very well. The 12 oars and 2 great drop keels that that's a picture of her there on the day that she was launched. But that'll give you an idea of what the Civil Service number 7 looked like, exactly like that. All of these boats were designed by the great yacht and boat designer George Lennox Watson. He did all his lifeboat work on a program. And just to give you an idea, the men were getting kitted up in the lifeboat house. And this is the sort of gear that they would have been wearing: oilskins, sou'wester, and a wraparound cork life belt, and probably leather sea boots also. Now, as the crew of the Civil Service were getting ready to put out, the captain got into a steam launch again and then went down aboard the guard ship in Dunleary, HMS Melampus, and he made a request to the captain, excuse me, for 6 volunteers to make up the other crew, the crew of the Hannah Picard. Now, the crew were mustered, and it was said that when volunteers were called for, the entire complement stepped forward. At any rate, 6 volunteers under Chief Petty Officer George Albert Rogers were delegated off to go back with Captain Crofton to the lifeboat house to man the lifeboat, and they were towed back, or they were brought back rather by the steam pinnace of HMS Melampus, which then proceeded to tow the Civil Service number 7 down to the mouth of the harbour while the Hannah Picard got kitted up. They towed the Civil Service down to the mouth of the harbour, cast off the tow, the sails were set, and they headed off out in the direction of the wreck of the ship, of the Palme. Now, at this stage, the Palme had drifted right up into the centre of the south side of Dublin Bay. It was said at the time that the sea conditions, the bay was a seething mass of foam and spray as far as the eye could see. And waves were coming over the East Pier, and sheets of spray were washing over the East Pier Lighthouse. Now, there were watchers on the shore. As I said, people had walked down the West Pier and people were watching what was going on through telescopes and binoculars. And there were also depositions given by some English-speaking members of the crew of the Palme later on at the inquest and at various hearings that were held. Apparently what happened was the lifeboat got practically up to the wreck of the Palme. They began to lower the sails with the intention of getting the oars out and coming about on the lee side of the wreck when the boat, a huge wave hit the boat and it overturned. Now there's a part of Dublin Bay where the Palme went aground, where the seabed slopes up very quickly from about a minimum of 10 metres to a minimum of about 5 metres. And if you look at that area, you can see it on a contour on the chart. If you look across the bay in high winds like that, there's always a line of breakers across there. So it's a very treacherous place. But the boat overturned. The men were all thrown into the water. Now, these boats were designed to be self-righting. And this is the big crux, the big mystery about this whole affair. That had the boat been able to right itself, as it should have, the men would probably have been able to get back aboard, but it stayed upside down. The crew of the Palme now attempted to become the rescuers. They launched one of their own boats and it was smashed to pieces against the ship's side. And very shortly afterwards, the weather closed in again and the men were all washed out of sight. Now, the Hannah Pickard was towed down to the mouth of the harbour about 15 minutes after the Civil Service number 7. And this is a contemporary illustration, as was some publications of the day. They got to within sight of the upturned lifeboat. They couldn't see any of the lifeboat men in the water and they could see the wrecked ship all the way. The masts had been cut away at this stage. That was standard practice for a ship that took the ground. And just then, the Hannah Pickard also overturned. And unlike its larger sister, the boat righted itself. A few of the men were in the water and they managed to get back aboard. Shortly after, the boat capsized again. And when it righted itself this time, the mizzen mast had carried away and half of the complement of oars were lost. So they couldn't make any progress in the direction of the upturned lifeboat or of the wreck of the Palme. And they couldn't go back in the direction of Kingstown from whence they come. So they had to look for their own lives now, and they just barely made it into this little harbour here. The only place along the shore that would afford them a landing spot. There's a little harbour in Blackrock called Vance's Harbour. If you're going by on the Dart train, you can see this. This is an old photograph, but it has hardly changed at all, except for that building there. That was a private railway station, belonged to the landowners here, Lord Clonfurdy and Sir Harcourt Lees. But they managed to get the boat in here into Vance's Harbour, and the boat was damaged in the process. It was high tide. Some damage was done to the boat. It was said at the time that waves were coming over the railway wall even here, and the railway line was flooded. This is a photograph taken in similar conditions at Blackrock. Now, a lot of the people, relatives of the lifeboat men of the Civil Service number 7, and a whole lot of other people from Dunleary had walked ashore and were waiting at Vance's Harbour to see the other lifeboat coming in. And they were anxious for news, particularly the relatives of the lifeboat men, of their kinfolk. And the crew of the Hannah Pickard had nothing but bad news to give them. They were given tickets to go back to Kingstown, some of them stayed with the boat, even though they were all soaked to the skin. And a team of shipwrights set to work as soon as the tide went out to try and repair the boat to get it ready to go back on station, to have it ready if needed. But a lot of people walked ashore with lanterns right into the night, hoping that some of the men might have come ashore. Lights were placed in the windows of houses along the bay. But the next morning, on Christmas Day, people along the shore, crowds of people along the shore, found 13 bodies of the lifeboat men. 2 bodies, Henry Williams and one of the other lifeboat men, the bodies weren't found until about a couple of weeks later. One of the Dunphy brothers. There were a father and son lost in this lifeboat and 2 pairs of brothers. Some of the bodies were brought to the morgue on London Bridge Road and others to St. Michael's Hospital. Now, on On St. Stephen's Day, this ship was seen leaving the harbour and heading out into the bay. This was the Irish Lights tender Tragically. Now, in command of the Tragically was this man here, Captain Thomas Mccombie. He was a recipient of the RNLI Silver Medal also for a rescue he carried out near the Bull in 1874. Now, he had heard about what was going on in the bay, and he'd gone down aboard his ship and mustered some of the crew and got steam up, and he was just about to head out to try and effect the rescue when he was approached by the harbour master, who told him not to go out. The harbour master was also a commissioner of Irish Lights. He said it was too hazardous to go out into the bay. So he tried to get the ship out into the bay on Christmas Day and had to turn back. And on St. Stephen's Day, he anchored about a mile from the wreck. And in 2 trips down to the wreck in this ordinary ship's longboat, he took all 19 people aboard, off the wreck of the Palme and back aboard the Tragically. Now, with him on that occasion was his 14-year-old son, the man sitting on the gunwale of the boat there. On the 2nd trip down to the wreck and back, they almost capsized. And the guy on the steering oar whispered to the captain that the steering oar had touched the bottom at one stage. So the captain told him not to tell the rest of the crew. But they came back, they brought the Tragically back into Dunleary Harbour alongside the Carlisle Pier and got a huge reception, a hero's welcome they got. Captain Mccombie was forced ashore carrying the little baby, little 5-month-old baby. That's the boat's crew of the Tragically there. Now, it has to be said that these men were extremely skillful oarsmen, experienced and skillful oarsmen. They would have been used to rowing in rough weather and going alongside light ships and lighthouses when they'd be resupplying them. That's Leopold Henry Mccombie, Captain's 14-year-old son, on the right there. Now, that's a picture of the Palme with the mast cut away. Apparently, one of the main deck houses was washed away, and the crew all had to crowd into the poop house there. And in actual fact, at high water, they had to come out and get on top of the poop. They were there for a few days. There were a lot of their provisions had been waterlogged, etc. And they were in a pretty bad way. But they were all housed in the Royal Marine Hotel initially, and the seamen then were brought to the Sailors' Rest Home in Sir John Rogerson's Quay. This is Captain Axel Viren, the captain of the Palme, and his wife Lydia, and his little baby daughter Esther Miranda. He was housed by the man who owned Power's Distillery, who allowed him to stay in his house until it was time to go back. The crew were eventually given some money from the Lifeboat Fund, which I'll tell you about now, and they were all repatriated. That's some of the crew of the Palme. They're not all here. Now, there was one Irishman, a man called Thomas Mullen, 2 Englishmen, a German and a Swede, and all the rest of them were Finns from the Åland Islands. I think if you look at them all, they're all fairly young, except 1 or 2 individuals there. And that would have been a feature of many of the ships from the Åland Islands. The young lad in the middle there was a stowaway when the ship left Mariehamn to head for Liverpool. And by the time he got to Liverpool, he had been subsumed into the crew. I don't know which of them would be the Irishman if he's there at all. I would opt for the fellow with the fancy shirt. Now, some of the men lived here in the harbour yard cottages, which have now been demolished near the town hall. The father and son, the Williamses, Alexander and Henry Williams, lived here, and Edward Shannon also lived here. But on the Christmas Eve fell on a Tuesday that year, and on the following Saturday there was an enormous funeral took place, which began at the town hall here. And this is a picture of the crowd beginning to gather at the town hall, and you can see the flag of the Kingstown Commissioners flying at half-mast. It was said to be the biggest funeral ever seen in Dublin, perhaps outside of some of the great political ones, like for Charles Stewart Parnell or Daniel O'Connell. It was absolutely enormous crowd attended it. 300 men from Ringsend came, 200 fishermen and 100 hobblers had come by train that morning, and they all marched in a body Some of the bodies were laid out in St. Michael's Church, and others were laid out in their homes. They were of mixed religions. 9 of the men were Catholics and 6 were Protestants. I'll tell you a little more about that in a moment. But now this is not a very clear photograph, but it gives you an idea of the density of the funerals. The funeral coming out of Marine Road and turning into Cumberland Street. Excuse me. Now the funeral was led by the band of the DMP, the Dublin Metropolitan Police. The crew of the Palme marched next, then the crew of the Tayrock, then the crew of the Hannah Picard, then the 13 hearses, each of them pulled by black horses, 4 black horses. The Lord Mayor was there, the Viceroy's representative was there. There was a whole lot of civic dignitaries, and then carriages of the general public and a host of people that walked behind. It was said that the cortege was a mile long and that the route was crowded from here all the way up to Dean's Grange Cemetery. There's a photograph of the hearses turning out of Marine Road. On the way, they turned down into Old Dunleary and went along by the seafront, and then up, turned left at Blackrock, up towards Dean's Grange Cemetery. On the more than likely would have been able to see the wreck of the Palme out in Dublin Bay. You can see where the masts had been cut away. She lies directly opposite between the Poolbeg Light and Blackrock Bats. So more than likely would have been seen by the mourners. In addition to that, they might have been able to see the wreck of the upturned hull of the Civil Service number 7, which by now had come in between Williamstown and Blackrock. And that's a picture of it there on the beach, and there's holes in the side of it. Now those holes were put there by the Coast Guard and by some of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, who were the first to get out to the boat, and they bashed holes in the side and in the top of it to see was there anybody trapped underneath. But there was nobody there. And there's another picture of the same thing. There's, you can see the holes that were put in the top of the boat there. The boat, I'm informed reliably, was broken up on the shore afterwards. It was never put back into service. It was thought that was a coffin that the man was carrying, but it was actually a basket. He was probably a cockle picker. And that's one of the Coast Guards there, the man with the stick. Now, I'll just tell you something about the lifeboat men themselves. As I said, there was a father and son and 2 pairs of brothers. Alexander Williams was the coxswain. He was 33 and he had 6 children. There were a total of 33 children left fatherless by the tragedy. 2 of them were born after the event. This is a picture of his father, Henry Williams. As I said, Henry had been coxswain of the lifeboat for about 40 years. And he had a very, very creditable service and was a winner of the RNLI silver medal. Patrick Power was the assistant boatman in the Royal St. George Yacht Club, the youngest member of the lifeboat crew. He was only 21 and he was a very, very popular man apparently with the yachtsmen. There's another picture of him there in his Royal St. George Yacht Club livery. Captain George Sanders was one of the 2 pairs of brothers. They came from a family that owned sailing trawlers in Dunleary, but at the time of the wreck, both him and his brother were yacht captains. He was the captain of a big steam yacht called the Ivor that was owned by Mr. Goff from Waterford. He was married and his wife was pregnant at the time. This is his brother, Frank Sanders. Frank had 5 children. He was also a yacht captain. Both of them had been sailing trawlermen, but he was the captain of another big yacht. I'll think of the name of it now in a moment, in Dunleary. William Dunphy was a lion fisherman, another of the pairs of brothers. Him and his brother lived in some of the little courts that were off the York Road. Hilton's Court they lived in. They fished with long lines out in the bay. John Barkley was a seaman. I think he was a ship's officer. He was from Dunleary, but I think he was just home on leave from whatever ship he was sailing on. I'm not sure what rank he was. I heard some mention that he may have been a captain of a ship. Edward Crowe was a porter on the Carlisle Pier, but he had been a seaman in his day. James Ryan was a harbour boatman. Edward Murphy worked on the dredger. He was an AB on the dredger that was in Dunleary. Edward Shannon was another harbour boatman also. John Baker was an AB that sailed on some of the colliers that went back and forth between Dunleary and ports in Wales, England. But he also served as a part-time yacht crew member in a yacht called the Finola in the Royal Irish Yacht Club. A great many of the fishermen in Dunleary did that also. Now, if you can imagine, when it was most horrendous scenes of grief at the funeral up in Dean's Grange, the entrance was manned by members of the crew of the Melampus. The sailors formed a guard of honour on either side of the entrance to the graveyard. Now, as I mentioned, that it was a custom at the time that Protestants and Catholics were buried in different parts of the graveyard. Protestants were buried on the left-hand side as you go in, and Catholics on the right. I'm sure that doesn't prevail today, but I think that was the custom of the day. But there are 6 men buried on the right. Just as you enter the cemetery, you'll find the graves on the right. This is the Williams grave, and you can see there's a bronze lifeboat and a bronze anchor on top of that. There's nearly always flowers on it also. But there are quite a lot of relations of relatives and descendants of a lot of the lifeboat men still living around Dunleary. The graves of Henry Underhill and John Barkley. Henry Underhill, I don't have an image of Henry Underhill or of Frank MacDonald. They were I think they were just Church of Ireland. The 2 Saunders brothers were Methodists, and this is the grave of George Saunders. His wife, Susanna, lived up till 1947. She later owned a drapery shop in Dunphy village, and her son, I'll tell you a little bit about her son later on. Her son became a doctor and went out to the Gold Coast, served as a medical officer out there. That's Frank Saunders' grave. And you can see there that on both of these graves, there's a lifeboat motif carved. There's an upside down lifeboat on this one, and on the other one, the lifeboat setting sail. But you can see here the triple tragedy to be seen on this gravestone here. Frank's wife, Frances, Fanny as she was known, was drowned on the RMS Leinster that was torpedoed in the last month of the war in 1918. She was on her way over to Holyhead to her daughter, who was having a very difficult childbirth, and who subsequently died in childbirth. And she's buried here with her mother and father also. She lived in Holyhead. Darren Blackmore gave me this fine photograph recently of Fanny Saunders with her 5 children. It's a beautiful photograph, I think. Terrible tragedy. The little boy on the left, his name was Samuel. That's him there. He became a flying officer in the First World War. He was a motor mechanic, and he became a flying officer and an instructor. And he lived to be 87 years of age. He lived to be a great age. And that's a picture of him with his flying officer's helmet on him. He lived in Dunleary for the rest of his life. These are some of the graves of the Catholic lifeboat men. There are, I think, 7 here and a couple more in behind the trees there. Also, it mentions about this ship being a Russian ship on this. And they're cared for in perpetuity by the RNLI. The RNLI paid for the funeral also. I notified the authorities about the fact that that one was tilted over the last time I was there, and it was very promptly put back in order. That's Sarah Wall, the lady in the middle there. That's Thomas Dunphy's daughter, and she lived to be 91 years of age. She died in 1981, so she was about nearly 6 years of age when the tragedy occurred, so she would have had a good recollection of it, I would imagine. And she's buried here with her father. Now, on the day of the tragedy, this man here was very proactive in organising things. This is Adam Finlater, the head of the great Dublin business house of Finlaters. He was chairman of the Kingstown Commissioners. He was in local politics. And he's a man of boundless energy, so he literally took things in hand. And he organised a meeting in the town hall on Christmas Eve to straight away organise a fund for the dependents of the lifeboat men and to organise the funeral. And he'd done a marvellous job on that. He also owned the Olympia Theatre, and there was a whole lot of events got up. The fund that he initiated was drawn together ultimately in three different strands: the Kingstown Commissioners Fund, the Irish Times Lifeboat Fund, and the Lord Mayor's Lifeboat Fund. All three funds were combined eventually, but money came in from all over, not only from Ireland, but from other countries as well. There's a lot of concerts and events held like that. Concerts were a big thing back then. But this is just one thing, one event. A lot of events were held to try and raise money, and all of the money that was raised was listed meticulously in the newspapers of the day. This was a concert that was given in the town hall. And the late Robbie Brennan of the Maritime Museum found the program for it when he was moving the stage in the town hall at one stage. And it was a lovely concert of light classical music given by a lot of the famous artists of the day. It was 2 and 6 in, and apparently it was full house. Now, this is Captain Thomas Mccombie in his old age. Now, he's wearing 3 medals there. He was immediately given the RNLI gold medal for the rescue. Now, he gallantly asserted that he was accepting it not only on his own behalf, but on behalf of the crew of the Taoireach that went out with him. The crew of the Taoireach got a monetary award, and I understand that that was the preferred thing among simple men who made up lifeboat crews and so forth. They would have gotten a monetary award. It wouldn't have been an awful lot, probably about the equivalent of a week's wages. But the other medal he's wearing is the British Empire Medal. I'll tell you a bit about it now in a minute. But Thomas Mccombie's great-granddaughter is with us tonight, Mrs. Tanis Pond, who gave me a lot of imagery to do with this because she's a descendant of Thomas Mccombie and she lives in Vancouver, and she's with us all the way from Vancouver tonight. So welcome, Tanis. And she gave me a picture of this cup that was given to Captain Thomas Mccombie at a reception in the Mansion House where he got his various medals. It was given by the Tsar of Russia, and there's an inscription in Swedish on it. That's over in Canada at the moment. In 1924 was the 100th anniversary of the founding of the RNLI, and there was a great pageant held in London. And all of the gold medal recipients who were alive, 8 of them, were invited to Buckingham Palace to be awarded the British Empire Medal by the King. There was only 2 Irish recipients, Captain Thomas Mccombie out there on the right, and Father John O'Shea from Waterford, who was ill and couldn't travel. But there was, as I said, it was a great big pageant at the time. These are Captain Mccombie's medals. Again, these are in Canada, and that's the British Empire Medal on the left. That's been superseded by the George Cross, and the RNLI Gold Medal in the centre, and Mccombie's Silver Medal on the right. Now, I just want to show you, I'll show you some moving footage now of Captain Mccombie. Captain Mccombie became very well known. He was fairly well known beforehand, but he was involved, he became the representative in Ireland for the Royal Humane Society. And he was involved later in the awarding of medals and citations and certificates, people who carried out rescues, notably at sea. But this is a bit of Pate newsreel footage of the Irish Army Cadet Corps, who were parading in public for the first time since the foundation of the state. They were at a mass parade in Griffith Barracks, and they marched around to the steps of UCD on Earlsford Terrace to have one of their number, a cadet called Anthony Horgan, given a medal by the Royal Humane Society and awarded to him by Captain Mccombie. You'll see Captain Mccombie handing the medal to General Brennan, and General Brennan giving it to Cadet Horgan. Pretty smart looking bunch of men, I must say. Now that's General Brennan there on the steps of UCD, and Captain Mccombie is standing beside him. You'll see him now in a moment. There he is holding the citation and the medal and giving them to General Brennan. And you'll see General Brennan pinning the medal on young Horgan. Young Horgan had jumped into a sluice, a mill race in Island Bridge, to rescue a man who had fallen in. A very heroic rescue. Now you'll see, when everyone else is applauding, you'll see Captain Mccombie saluting. I think he may well have been a member of the Royal Naval Reserve. It would have been quite common for merchant navy officers of the day to be members of the Royal Naval Reserve. I don't know whether he was or not, but it would have been quite common if you had. See him saluting there. This was in 1931. Captain Mccombie died in 1934. But he was always preaching the doctrine of teaching young people how to swim and teaching young people how to do resuscitation and life-saving. Just get our last glimpse of Thomas Mccombie there now on the left. This is Thomas Mccombie's son who accompanied him on the rescue, Leopold Henry Mccombie. He was awarded a medal by the Dublin Corporation, who awarded him the medal on the night that his father was given his awards. He was a Merchant Navy officer, cadet, an apprentice officer, and he served with the Lord Line on sailing ships. He was actually shipwrecked twice. That's the Palme medal that he was given. There were only 3 of these struck. One was given to a man who had volunteered to go out with the Pool Beg lifeboat. Incidentally, I meant to tell you, the Pool Beg lifeboat made an attempt to get out of the bay several times, and on Christmas Eve, he actually got over as far as the wreck, only to find that the crew had been rescued by the crew of the Tayrock. But this is the Palme medal that was struck, and this one here was given to the man who took charge of the Tayrock while Captain Mccombie was carrying out the rescue. He was the head of the Marine Office, the Mercantile Marine Office in Dublin, Captain Alexander Walker, a very experienced seaman in square riggers, and he was given the RNLI, the Lord Mayor's Palme medal also. Leopold Henry was also given a pair of inscribed binoculars and a gold watch seen, but I don't have a photograph of. Somebody in Wexford owns it. Leopold Henry, he was shipwrecked twice, once in Nova Scotia and once on the near Ceylon somewhere. And they had to sail up in the Maldive Islands, and they had to sail from the Maldive Islands up to Colombo in the ship's lifeboats. But when he was home and the Boer War broke out, and he joined up the Cameron Highlanders, and he went from there to South Africa, and he joined the South African Constabulary, who were sort of a paramilitary police. And he went from there, he stayed in South Africa, and he became Assistant Commissioner of Police in British East Africa, which is now Rwanda. Now, after a skirmish with the Germans back at his camp, one of his native troops ran amok and started shooting people, and he shot poor Leopold Henry in the neck, and he died. This is a friend of mine, Eilish MacDonald, who does educational missionary work with young girls in Uganda. And I told her about the fact that Leopold Henry was buried in a lonely little graveyard in a place called Cabarol. And she looked for it and found it. A little grave with a Celtic cross on it, all on its own, in a very lonely little graveyard. And I was delighted that she did that. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission weren't really aware of this, and I sent it to them. George Sanders' widow that I told you about opened a shop here. She worked very hard as a chair lady for a long time, and she ultimately opened a shop in Dalkey, near beside the Queen's, that shop there with the lady outside it. Her son, George, went to Wesley College, and then he went to Trinity College and qualified as a doctor. Went out to the Gold Coast and became a medical officer out there. And he's regarded almost as a saint out there because he had to tackle head on a load of endemic diseases. There were epidemics of all sorts of diseases that he tackled that hadn't been addressed before. Diseases such as cholera and yellow fever, and most of all, sleeping sickness. And the things that he set up for sleeping sickness are still practiced in Africa today. He also set up a system of mobile dispensaries, very, very highly regarded. When he retired in 1957, he went back out to do voluntary missionary work, and he was killed in a car crash in 1960. This is Harriet Williams, Alexander Williams' widow, and she had 6 children. They're mostly grown up when the tragedy occurred. There were various inquests and inquiries held, and in some of them, there were some very distasteful references to the fact a blame culture arose. And some people were trying to say that the lifeboat men were somehow at fault in not doing certain procedures, and that is why the lifeboat didn't right itself. And she was rightfully incensed at that, and she forbade any mention of the lifeboat thereafter in her house, and she pleaded with her sons not to go to sea. Nevertheless, her eldest son, Harry, he was a captain in the Boys Brigade in the Mariners Church. That's the Mariners Church that now houses the Maritime Museum. And you'll see a picture of him there, the man with the stick there over on the left, seated. He joined the Royal Naval Flying Corps during the First War, and he was based at Polegate Base. That's him on the right there. He piloted, he was a chief petty officer. He became the pilot of one of these airships that used to do escort duty with convoys and drop bombs on German destroyers and so forth. He was shot down in the North Sea by a German destroyer, and his co-pilot was killed, and he was just picked up just in time. After the war, he emigrated to America, married his sweetheart from Blackrock, Emily Clegg, and emigrated to America and became the maintenance manager in a school near Philadelphia. Back in 1995, he had only one son, Alexander, and Alex came over and I met him, and a wonderful man, sadly passed away, a very, very kind gentleman indeed. And we had a long discourse about the lifeboats and so forth. William Dunphy, one of the two pairs of brothers, his son Michael joined the Navy in 1912. He was a quarter of an inch under the size that was allowable for recruitment, and they made a special exception for him. He was 5'2" 3/4. You had to be 5'3". But he was taken out of his ship and put into the Royal Naval Division and sent to fight in the trenches in Gallipoli. And he was badly wounded there, and he died aboard a hospital ship that was heading for Alexandria in Egypt. This is John Dunphy, Thomas Dunphy's son. He joined the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and he fought in France. And he was killed in action 3 months before the war ended. He's buried here in Marois. He was wounded at the Battle of Cateau, and he died shortly afterward, Le Cateau, northern France, Marois Communal Cemetery. I think there's a terrible, sad, tragic thread running, contradictory thread running through this entire story of one generation saving lives at sea, and the next generation, some of them people being killed needlessly, perhaps in the First World War. This is John Dunphy's grave in the cemetery there. This is Thomas Mccombie's one of his other sons, Robert. Now, Robert was an Anglican minister in New Zealand, and he volunteered to go with the New Zealand Expeditionary Force to France as a stretcher bearer. And he was killed 2 days before the war ended. I think that's terrible, tragic indeed. A non-combatant stretcher bearer and was killed 2 days before the war ended. This is Captain Axel Virren in later life. He had 3 children here. The Palme wasn't insured at the time of the tragedy. And him and his father bought another ship, but it wasn't a success. And he gave up the sea and he became a customs officer with the Russian government on the Finnish mainland. That's his wife, Lydia. And the girl on the left here is the little baby that was rescued. And she came back to Dunleary sometime in the 1960s, I think in the late 1960s, and made herself known to the lifeboat people that she was the little girl, Esther Miranda, that had been rescued from the wreck of the Palme by the Terrot. Before he left Dublin, Captain Mccombie put the Palme up for sale, and it was bought by a carpenter called Gaffney in Blackrock for £50. And he a whole lot of timber off it, and he built a whole lot of outhouses and barns in Blackrock. Indeed, he had to be rescued twice by the Hannah Picard off the wreck as he was stuck out there in a storm on 2 occasions. That's a picture of the Palme there with the mast cut away. I don't know who the man is. It's probably the captain, because he did go back out aboard when the weather had abated and to bring some stuff ashore that he sold, some sails and what have you. That's a picture of the Palme in a state of deterioration. Apparently, it was visible at all stages of the tide up to 1910, after which it only became visible at low water. Myself and a colleague went over the site of the Palme. I knew where the site was from old fishermen in Ringsend, who gave us the marks. And we got a huge sub-bottom reading, and a subsequent dive there showed just a few bits of timber and iron and weed covered sticking up from the seabed. This little red brick house is nearly beside the Poolbeg Yacht and Boat Club. It's called Fjord. It was built by an amazing man who had a boat, and they had a group called the Graphic Cruisers Club. I'll tell you more about that some other time. There's a lecture in that alone. But he built that house in 1896, and he got the companionway from the Palme and used it as the main stairs in the house. That's still there today. Cuban mahogany and pitch pine. He also used some of the paneling from the cabin around the stairwell. This is part of that newel post of that stair companionway that's in the Maritime Museum in Dunleary, and you can see the name board from the wreck of the Palme there also, and some small lifeboats that were made from the timber of the Palme. That's it there, and if you just have a look at the back of it there, you can see part of the original name of Frederick Tudor inscribed into the back of that. This is one of the lifeboats that was washed in on the shore, shown to us by the late Robbie Brennan here, who was manager of the Maritime Museum. The two bodies that were recovered later, William Dunphy and Henry Williams, weren't recovered for about 2 weeks later, and neither of them were wearing their life jackets. Henry was discovered out near Ireland's Eye, and William Dunphy at the Poolbeg Lighthouse. This is a small table that's in RNLI headquarters, and it's made from a piece of the hull of the Civil Service number 7. They were made from double diagonal planking and copper fastened, and there's a little brass plate on it. It was found in an antique shop in Parnell Street and bought and given to the RNLI some years ago. Every year for the last few decades, there's a commemorative service on Christmas Eve for the lifeboat men who were lost out in Dunleary. Now, it used to be just held at the memorial stone that I'm going to show you now in a moment, and then the lifeboat would go out and cast a wreath. But in recent years, the ceremony is held down here in the lighthouse place down at the end of the East Pier in Dunleary. And there was none this year, unfortunately, but the lifeboats did go out and cast a wreath. The lifeboats would appear and fully manned, and that's what happened Roger Kirker last year. The year before last, rather, at that. In 1995, I was very honoured to be asked to go out with the lifeboat to cast a few wreaths at the spot where the tragedy occurred. And the day couldn't have been different from that which it was 100 years previously. The sun was shining, the sea was flat calm, and just by coincidence, the Irish Lights tender Groneway behind us and steamed into the harbour. There used to be, this is the memorial stone. I'll show you another picture now, but and there used to be a ceremony there every Christmas Eve before they started doing it down at the lighthouse. That's the memorial stone there with the names of the lifeboat men inscribed on it, just brief details of the wreck. It used to be part of the stone outcrop there upon which the George monument is sited. And it was quarried out of there and put on a higher level when the walkway was made. The wreck of the Palme and the lifeboat disaster is mentioned in Ulysses by James Joyce in a conversation that's been had in Nighttown. It mentions an ill-fated Norwegian bark. Now that's incorrect. She wasn't a bark, she was a full rig ship, and she was Finnish and not Norwegian. Nevertheless, you also mention a poem by Albert William Quill that appeared in the Irish Times, and I've actually found that, and it's a very long-winded poem. This is the last slide, and it's a marble plaque, a granite plaque rather, that was placed on the old lifeboat house when it was refurbished some years ago. And I'm going to read the inscription on it for you. It says, "From this stone boathouse in 1895 in a terrible storm, 15 brave men from this lifeboat station rowed out to rescue the crew of a wrecked ship. Their boat overturned and they were all drowned. The memorial is a rough granite stone nearby with their names engraved. And it concludes with the words, 'Their sacrifice is not forgotten.' I'm full sure But as long as people like ourselves continue to use the sea, and as long as lifeboat men continue to be prepared to go out to rescue those of us who are in peril on the sea, that their sacrifice won't be forgotten. Thank you.
Well done.
Brilliant, Cormac. Excellent.
Well done, Cormac.
Thank you very much.
That's brilliant, Cormac. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Fair play, Cormac. Well done.
Very
Cormac, that was a
interesting.
fantastic presentation, and thank you very much.
Really interesting.
Absolutely
Excellent, Cormac.
fantastic. And fantastic work. You.
Thank you, Cormac. Very good.
My pleasure.
Excellent, Cormac. Really, really good.
Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you'll all give a contribution to the lifeboat at some stage.
Yeah,
Mike,
Thank
just
you very
did
much,
it there
Cormac.
now.
lifeboat information.
Anybody, I don't know whether we have any time for questions or not. We might have got a little bit over the time.
Yeah, no, we've got plenty of time for questions, Cormac.
Okay, Darrell.
Yeah.
Fire away. If there are any.
Cormac, Joe Ryan here.
Joe.
How did the name Civil Service number 7 come about?
Come on. Yeah.
There have been several lifeboats called Civil Service number, whatever, Joe. It's the British Civil Service had a fund for the lifeboats, and the boats were literally built from money collected by from civil servants in the British Civil Service. So that would have encompassed the Irish Civil Service as well at the time.
Thank you. Thanks for
Did
that,
you ever
Cormac.
find out what happened or why it capsized? Didn't
No,
write it down.
Negley, that was the whole crux of the issue. And as I said, it became a bit of a blame culture. The boat had been tested for righting several times. Now, they did this by a process called parbuckling. That involves wrapping a big strap around it and lifting it with a crane and tumbling the boat upside down. And it and several boats that were built to the same design were tested meticulously by parbuckling. And in each and every case, it righted itself with the sails up with various circumstances. And for some reason or other, nobody knows why the boat didn't right itself. And it became the subject of very acrimonious debate at various inquiries and inquests that were held. They're all reported in the paper, but no conclusion was ever arrived at as to why the boat didn't right itself, because they tested one shortly afterwards in Cork Harbour, and it righted itself, one that was identical to that one. So we never know.
Very sad.
There was a suggestion, I believe, that the mast might have stuck in the sand. I did hear that.
It may possibly have, Stephen. Yeah, sorry, I omitted to mention that for the Lifeboat Fund, it was a total of £17,000 raised. I forgot to mention that during the course of the talk. And the widows were being given £1 a week, and a lot of the money was invested to educate some of the children of the lifeboat men and so forth. I don't know what became of the residue of the fund. I haven't been able to find that out. But £17,000 was a lot of money. I figure you'd have to multiply that by about a factor of about 150 today, which would get you up to about over £2 million.
Yeah,
A lot of money. A lot of money.
Stephen, does the wreck of the lifeboat feature greatly in the history of Dunleary, or is it just of the past?
In Dublin.
Is it a constant item in the history of the Dunleary lifeboat?
Johnny, it's a really well-known event, and it has been commemorated, as I say, since God knows when, way back in the history of the lifeboats in Dunleary. And as I say, there's an awful lot of people descended from the lifeboat men there, and it's a very, very well-known event. And it's, in actual fact, it's the worst tragedy ever to have occurred in the history of Irish lifeboats. And it's one of the worst ever to have occurred in the history of the RNLI generally.
So certainly, it's very well marked, and it's it's incredible. I think the time of the year that it occurred put it very much into the focus of anybody who was involved and the families that were left behind. And can I just take this very brief opportunity, not for long, just to thank Cormac for a really great presentation. And I was pleased to hear it originally back in 1995, and I think it was Black Rock, Cormac, wasn't it?
So if I might add, this is Stephen Wynn is the manager of the RNLI in Dunleary, an old friend.
And so, you know, thanks for a really good presentation. It's really good, and it's great that, you know, the memories are kept alive. It's important.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cormac. Great presentation. Enjoyed it.
Hey, Cormac.
Great job, Cormac.
Thank you.
Cormac, was the weather easier by the time the T-Rex came out? Or was
the weather had abated slightly. That was the only thing. I think that the full fury of the storm had passed, but there was still a huge fetch in the waves because it had been blowing strong easterly straight into Dublin Bay for well over a week, for a couple of weeks nearly. So the conditions were still horrendous. The wind had abated to some extent, all right, yeah.
But the boat handling of the Irish Lights people must have been legendary. I mean, they must have had so much experience of big seas and hideous weather.
Absolutely, yeah. I couldn't agree more, yeah.
Cormac, I have a question. You had a picture there of the lifeboat people, the people who got awards over in London. I think there were 6 of them standing there on a roof, 6 or 7.
Yeah.
There was a guy in the middle with about 25 medals on his chest. I was wondering who he might have been.
Yeah, well, there were various lifeboat men. Now, there were mostly lifeboat men there, but there was one army officer who had taken charge of the lifeboat to a wreck called the Rohilla. But the man with all the medals, I can't remember his name, but it's not the most famous lifeboat man in history. It's in that photograph as well. He's the second from the left. Blog of Cromer.
Henry Blog.
His career spanned 2 world wars and beyond. And in his life, he won 3 RNLI gold medals and I think 4 silver medals and a few bronze ones and citations and everything else. I meant to mention that. It just slipped my mind. I can't remember the other man's name, Stephen.
No matter, no matter.
Cormac, I have a question.
Yeah.
There was no change made to the design of lifeboats following the tragedy, was it?
No. Strangely enough, Gordon, the boat that replaced the Dunleary, the Civil Service number 7 was built to exactly the same lines.
Mm.
It was built in Holways in Windmill Lane on City Quay. And I did wonder about that because that boat didn't come along till 1898. But it was actually tested several times for writing. And I often wondered why the exact design was used. It's a very good point. Why the exact design was used, knowing that there had been a failure and there was nothing conclusive had been arrived at as to why the boat didn't right itself. So, and
yeah, well, Cormac, I've suffered the indignity of having the top of my mast in a dinghy stuck in the mud in the middle of a racing fleet and the boat not coming up. So I'm very sympathetic to the suggestion that the lifeboat was stuck in the sand. It's a denial of nature. It's a hideous state to be in.
I can imagine, yeah. Well, it was a possibility that was discussed at the time that the sails being up might have, if they hadn't actually gotten the sails down, take them down, that might have precluded the lifeboat from rising. There was some suggestion that various caps on buoyancy things were left open. It was difficult to say because a lot of people went out to the upturned lifeboat and took bits off it and took a whole lot of pieces off it before a further investigation could be made. But even so, the lifeboat was tested with all these things, tested for righting, with various things left open, and in each and every instance it righted itself. But it wasn't too long after that well, I suppose it was another 25 years almost before the first motor lifeboat came on stream in Dunleary. That was also called Dunleary. And it was paid for by the residue of another disaster fund called the Taylor Fund. Or largely paid for it anyway. A ship that was wrecked on Palme Island.
I think that was in 1919, if my memory is right.
I think around about that, yeah. I think it was initiated in 1913, I think, but then
horsepower, Something.
I know, it was a petrol engine. In actual fact, I seem to recall, Stephen, that you gave me a set of instructions to coxswains how to conduct yourself with the engine, and it was a very, very long, convoluted set of instructions. So all the things you had to do, and all the forms you had to fill out, and stuff like that. I still have it at home.
Hasn't changed. Hasn't changed.
I've never put my hand up to give lectures, but I was asked to give this lecture on many different occasions by various groups, and it was always a great pleasure to do so in aid of the RNLI, I have to say. And all of our talks here with the Old Gaffers Association are to that end. They're all in aid of the RNLI. We normally hold them in the Pool Beg Yacht and Boat Club, and we'd have the yellow welly there for contributions. And over the years, we've donated a few, Bob, all right. Long may it continue.
Cormac.
Sure.
Pat here. How well done. Superb, excellent. Anyway, in all my sailing experience, and I've done a lot of sailing, a lot of miles around the world now and again, I've only ever had to call out the lifeboat twice in my whole life. And Cormac, the thing is, it was the same lifeboat each time. It was Ross Lair lifeboat when I got caught bloody well in nets on the way down and on the way back. And it was a couple of years between it. And the boys said to me, Pat, welcome back again, you know. The same lifeboat.
Well, it's very gratifying to know that the lifeboat is there for you, Pat.
No, great.
It wasn't on your round the world trip.
Sorry?
It wasn't on your voyage around the world that you were.
No, the only problem there was nets on propellers and that, but the water was always warm. You could go down and clear it.
No
problems there.
Cormac.
Yeah. Go ahead, Paddy.
One of the photographs showed the crew on the boat and they all at the oars. I was wondering what space would be left then to take people on board if they needed.
Had to make. Look, there was 19 people on board, right? So
yeah.
There was 9 people and a baby in one, and 9 people in another, right? So they would have had to just hunker down on the bottom boards in between. I wondered about that myself. That was the boat that they actually used, but I mean, I'm sure they would have been able to make themselves fairly small to get down on the know the bottom of the boat and to cram in like sardines. But they managed it anyway, you know.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I say that is it just comes to mind that I think on one of the lectures you gave about the Lusitania, that one of the lifeboats came off the Lusitania and they were able to put 50 people into the lifeboat.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So,
yeah, I mean the capacity of one of those big wooden ship lifeboats, Paddy, would have been enormous.
Would be bigger.
They were built way bigger. Yeah, they would have been about
bigger. Okay.
45 foot long and about maybe 10 foot beam. You know. And, built for carrying. You know. That was just a ship's longboat. That wasn't one of the ship's lifeboats. That was a boat that they would have used for going ashore or going onto lighthouses and lightships. The actual lifeboats on the Terrace would have been totally different to that. They would have been standard clinker-built ships, lifeboats. There was a lot of them still around when I was a young man. I'd been converted into cabin cruisers. In fact, I saw one of the lifeboats off the Lusitania in Holt. The name carved on it. It had a Model T Ford engine in it.
Yeah, you know that around the gunnels there was a rope, ship's rope looped around. Was that for people to climb?
They're just called grab lines, Paddy. They're still on lifeboats today.
Or just for holding on?
No, that's it. Yeah, just to grab a hold of.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry again. Could I just thank Mrs. Tanis Pond, who's with us tonight? As I said, a descendant of Captain Thomas Mccombie, his great granddaughter, and who has had a great interest in the genealogy aspect of the thing, and who gave me a wealth of material when I originally put the talk together, and I gave a talk about the Mccombie family also. But thank you very much, Tanis. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you for having me, Cormac.
All the way from Vancouver. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Okay, well, there's nothing else to do except once again thank Cormac for a absolutely excellent talk. His background knowledge is absolutely amazing, and it was a pleasure to listen to you, Cormac, and we all really enjoyed it. And thank you very much, and thank you on behalf of DBOGA.